When the Sleeper Wakes Part 2 by Herbert George Wells. Chapter 20. I'm the City Ways. And that night, unknown and unsuspected, Graham, dressed in the costume of an inferior wind vane official keeping holiday, and accompanied by Asano and Labor Company canvas, surveyed the city through which he had wandered when it was veiled in darkness. But now he saw it lit and waking, a whirlpool of life. In spite of the surging and swaying of the forces of revolution, in spite of the unusual discontent, the mutterings of the greater struggle of which the first revolt was but the prelude, the myriad streams of commerce still flowed wide and strong. He knew now something of the dimensions and quality of the new age, but he was not prepared for the infinite surprise of the detailed view, for the torrent of color and vivid impressions that poured past him. This was his first real contact with the people of these latter days. He realized that all that had gone before, saving his glimpses of the public theaters and markets, had had its element of seclusion, had been a movement within the comparatively narrow political quarter that all his previous experiences had. Revolved immediately about the question of his own position. But here was the city at the busiest hours of night, the people to a large extent returned to their own immediate interests, the resumption of the real informal life, common habits of the new time. They emerged at first into a street whose opposite ways were crowded with the blue canvas liveries. This swarm, Graham saw, was a portion of a procession. It was odd to see a procession parading the city seated. They carried banners of coarse red stuff with red letters. "No disarmament," said the banners, for the most part in crudely daubed letters and with variant spelling. "And why should we disarm? No disarming, no disarming." Banner after banner went by, a stream of banners flowing past, and at last, at the end, the song of the revolt and a noisy band of strange instruments. "They all ought to be at work," said Asano. "They have had no food these 2 days, or they have stolen it." Presently, Asano made a detour to avoid the congested crowd that gaped upon the occasional passage of dead bodies from hospital to a mortuary, the gleanings after death's harvest of the first revolt. That night, few people were sleeping, everyone was abroad. A vast excitement, perpetual crowds, perpetually changing, surrounded Graham. His mind was confused and darkened by an incessant tumult, by the cries and enigmatical fragments of the social struggle that was as yet only beginning. Everywhere festoons and banners of black and strange decorations intensified the quality of his popularity. Everywhere he caught snatches of that crude, thick dialect that served the illiterate class, the class that is beyond the reach of phonograph culture, in their commonplace intercourse. Everywhere this trouble of disarmament was in the air, with a quality of immediate stress of which he had no inkling during his seclusion in the wind vane quarter. He perceived that as soon as he returned he must discuss this with Ostrog, this and the greater issues. Of which it was the expression, in a far more conclusive way than he had so far done. Perpetually, that night, even in the earlier hours of their wanderings about the city, the spirit of unrest and revolt swamped his attention, to the exclusion of countless strange things he might otherwise have observed. This preoccupation made his impressions fragmentary, yet amidst so much that was strange and vivid, no subject, however personal and insistent, could exert undivided sway. There were spaces when the revolutionary movement passed clean out of his mind, was drawn aside like a curtain from before some startling new aspect of the time. Helen had swayed his mind to this intense earnestness of inquiry, but there came times when she, even, receded beyond his conscious thoughts. At one moment, for example, he found they were traversing the religious quarter, for the easy transit about the city afforded by the moving ways rendered sporadic churches and chapels no longer necessary, and his attention was vividly arrested by the facade of one of the Christian sects. They were traveling seated on one of the swift upper ways. The place leapt upon them at a bend and advanced rapidly towards them. It was covered with inscriptions from top to base in vivid white and blue, save where a vast and glaring kinematograph transparency presented a realistic New Testament scene, and where a vast festoon of black, to show that the popular religion followed the popular politics, hung across the lettering. Graham had already become familiar with the phonotype writing, and these inscriptions arrested him, being to his sense for the most part almost incredible blasphemy. Among the less offensive were "Salvation on the first floor" and "Turn to the right." "Put your money on your Maker." "The sharpest conversion in London." "Expert operators." "Look, Slippy," what Christ would say to the sleeper, "join the up-to-date saints." "Be a Christian without hindrance to your present occupation." "All the brightest bishops on the bench tonight," and prices as usual. "Brisk blessings for busy businessmen." "But this is appalling," said Graham, as that deafening scream of mercantile piety towered above them. "What is appalling?" asked his little officer, apparently seeking vainly for anything unusual in this shrieking enamel. "This! Surely the essence of religion is reverence." "Oh, that!" Asano looked at Graham. "Does it shock you?" he said in the tone of one who makes a discovery. "I suppose it would, of course." "I had forgotten. Nowadays the competition for attention is so keen, and people simply haven't the leisure to attend to their souls, you know, as they used to do." He smiled. "In the old days you had quiet Sabbaths and the countryside, though somewhere I've read of Sunday afternoons that—" "But that," said Graham, glancing back at the receding blue and white. "That is surely not the only. There are hundreds of different ways, but of course, if a sect doesn't tell, it doesn't pay. Worship has moved with the times. There are high-class sects with quieter ways, costly incense and personal attentions and all that. These people are extremely popular and prosperous. They pay several dozen lions for those apartments to the council, to you, I should say." Graham still felt a difficulty with the coinage, and this mention of a dozen lions brought him abruptly to that matter. In a moment the screaming temples and their swarming touts were forgotten in this new interest. A turn of a phrase suggested, and an answer confirmed the idea that gold and silver were both demonetized, that stamped gold which had begun its reign amidst the merchants of Phoenicia was at last dethroned. The change had been graduated but swift, brought about by an extension of the system of checks that had even in his previous life already practically superseded gold in all the larger business transactions. The common traffic of the city, the common currency indeed of all the world, was conducted by means of the little brown, green, and pink council checks for small amounts, printed with a blank PE. Asano had several with him, and at the first opportunity he supplied the gaps in his set. They were printed not on terrible paper, but on a semi-transparent fabric of silken flexibility, interwoven with silk. Across them all sprawled the facsimile of Graham's signature, his first encounter with the curves and turns of that familiar autograph for 203 years. Some intermediary experiences made no impression sufficiently vivid to prevent the matter of the disarmament claiming his thoughts again. A blurred picture of a Theosophist temple that promised miracles in enormous letters of unsteady fire was least submerged perhaps, but then came the view of the dining hall in Northumberland Avenue. That interested him very greatly. By the energy and thought of Asano, he was able to view this place from a little screened gallery reserved for the attendants of the tables. The building was pervaded by a distant muffled hooting, piping and bawling, of which he did not at first understand the import, but which recalled a certain mysterious leathery voice he had heard after the resumption of the lights on the night of his solitary wandering. He had grown accustomed now to vastness and great numbers of people. Nevertheless, this spectacle held him for a long time. It was as he watched the table service more immediately beneath, and interspersed with many questions and answers concerning details, that the realization of the full significance of the feast of several thousand people came to him. It was his constant surprise to find that points that one might have expected to strike vividly at the very outset never occurred to him until some trivial detail suddenly shaped as a riddle and wired to his versions. It had not occurred to him that this continuity of the city, this exclusion of weather, these vast halls and ways, involved the disappearance of the household, that the typical Victorian home, the little brick cell containing kitchen and scullery, living rooms and bedrooms, had, save for the ruins that diversified the countryside, vanished as surely as the wattle hut. But now he saw what a divertiverals ifrid of absent. People had their sleeping rooms with, it might be, antechambers, rooms that were always sanitary, at least whatever the degree of comfort and privacy. And for the rest, they lived much as many people had lived in the new-made giant hotels of the Victorian days, eating, reading, thinking, playing, conversing, all in places of public resort, going to their work in the industrial quarters of the city, or doing business in their offices in the trading section. He perceived at once how necessarily this state of affairs had developed from the Victorian city. The fundamental reason for the modern city had ever been the economy of cooperation. The chief thing to prevent the merging of the separate households in his own generation was simply the still imperfect civilization of the people, the strong barbaric pride, passions, and prejudices, the jealousies, rivalries, and violence of the middle and lower classes, which had necessitated the entire separation of contiguous households. But the change, the taming of the people, had been in rapid progress even then. In his brief 30 years of previous life, he had seen an enormous extension of the habit of consuming meals from home. The casually patronized horsebox coffee house had given place to the open and crowded aerated bread shop. For instance, women's clubs had had their beginning, and an immense development of reading rooms, lounges, and libraries had witnessed to the growth of social confidence. These promises had by this time attained to their complete fulfillment. The locked and barred household had passed away. These people below him belonged, he learnt, to the lower middle class, the class just above the blue laborers, a class so accustomed in the Victorian period to feed with every precaution of privacy that its members, when occasion confronted them with a public meal, would usually hide their embarrassment under horseplay or a markedly militant demeanor. But these gaily, if lightly dressed people below, albeit vivacious, hurried, and uncommunicative, were dexterously mannered and certainly quite at their ease with regard to one another. He noted a slight significant thing. The table, as far as he could see, was, and remained delightfully neat. There was nothing to parallel the confusion, the broadcast crumbs, the splashes of viand and condiment, the overturned drink and displaced ornaments which would have marked the stormy progress of the Victorian meal. The table furniture was very different. There were no ornaments, no flowers, and the table was without a cloth, being made, he learnt, of a solid substance having the texture and appearance of damask. He discerned that this damask substance was patterned with gracefully designed trade advertisements. In a sort of recess before each diner was a complete apparatus of porcelain and metal. There was one plate of white porcelain, and by means of taps for hot and cold volatile fluids. The diner washed this himself between the courses. He also washed his elegant white metal knife and fork and spoon as occasion required. Soup and the chemical wine that was the common drink were delivered by similar taps, and the remaining covers traveled automatically in tastefully arranged dishes down the table along silver rails. The diner stopped these and helped himself at his discretion. They appeared at a little door at one end of the table and vanished at the other. That turn of democratic sentiment in decay, that ugly pride of menial souls, which renders equals loath to wait on one another, was very strong, he found, among these people. He was so preoccupied with these details that it was only just as he was leaving the place that he remarked the huge advertisement dioramas that marched majestically along the upper walls and proclaimed the most remarkable commodities. Beyond this place they came into a crowded hall, and he discovered the cause of the noise that had perplexed him. They paused at a turnstile at which a payment was made. Graham's attention was immediately arrested by a violent, loud hoot, followed by a vast, leathery voice. "The master is sleeping peacefully," it said vociferately. "He is in excellent health. He is going to devote the rest of his life to aeronautics. He says women are more beautiful than ever. Galloop! Wow! Our wonderful civilization astonishes him beyond measure. Beyond all measure. Galloop! He puts great trust in Boss Ostrog, absolute confidence in Boss Ostrog. Ostrog is to be his chief minister, is authorized to remove or reinstate public officers. All patronage will be in his hands. All patronage in the hands of Boss Ostrog." The councillors had been sent back to their own prison above the council house. Graham stopped at the first sentence and, looking up, beheld a foolish trumpet face from which this was brayed. This was the General Intelligence Machine. For a space it seemed to be gathering breath, and a regular throbbing from its cylindrical body was audible. Then it trumpeted "Galloop, Galloop," and broke out again. Paris is now pacified. All resistance is over. Galloop. The black police hold every position of importance in the city. They fought with great bravery, singing songs written in praise of their ancestors by the poet Kipling. Once or twice they got out of hand and tortured and mutilated wounded and captured insurgents, men and women. Moral: don't go rebelling. Ha ha! Galloop, Galloop. They are lively fellows. Lively, brave fellows. Let this be a lesson to the disorderly banderlog of this city. Ja, banderlog, filth of the earth. Galloop, Galloop, filleth of the earth. Galloop, Galloop. The voice ceased. There was a confused murmur of disapproval among the crowd. "Damned niggers!" A man began to harangue near them. "Is this the master's doing, brothers? Is this the master's doing?" "Black police," said Graham. "What is that?" "You don't mean—" Asano touched his arm and gave him a warning look, and forthwith another of these mechanisms screamed deafeningly and gave tongue in a shrill voice. Yaha, yaha, yah! Hear a live paper yelp. Live paper, yaha! Shocking outrage in Paris. Yaha! The Parisians exasperated by the black police to the pitch of assassination. Dreadful reprisals. Savage times come again. Blood, blood. Yaha! The nearer Babel machine hooted stupendously. Galloop, Galloop drowned the end of the sentence and proceeded in a rather flatter note than before with novel comments on the horrors of disorder. "Law and order must be maintained," said the nearer Babel machine. "But," began Graham. "Don't ask questions here," said Asano, "or you will be involved in an argument." "Then let us go on," said Graham, "for I want to know more of this." As he and his companion pushed their way through the excited crowd that swarmed to meet these voices towards the exit, Graham conceived more clearly the proportion and features of this room. Altogether, great and small, there must have been nearly 1,000 of these erections, piping, hooting, bawling, and gabbling in that great space, each with its crowd of excited listeners, the majority of them men dressed in blue canvas. There were all sizes of machines, from the little gossiping mechanisms that chuckled out mechanical sarcasm in odd corners, through a number of grades, to such 50-foot giants as that which had first hooted over Graham. This place was unusually crowded because of the intense public interest in the course of affairs in Paris. Evidently, the struggle had been much more savage than Ostrich had represented it. All the mechanisms were discoursing upon that topic, and the repetition of the people made the huge hive buzz with such phrases as lynched policemen, women burnt alive, fuzzy-wuzzy. "But does the master allow such things?" asked a man near him. "Is this the beginning of the—" Master's rule? Is this the beginning of the master's rule? For a long time after he had left the place, the hooting, whistling, and braying of the machines pursued him. "Eight skittle hop, galloop, galloop, yah, yah, yap, yap." Is this the beginning of the master's rule? Directly they were out upon the ways he began to question Asano closely on the nature of the Parisian struggle. This disarmament. What was their trouble? What does it all mean? Asano seemed chiefly anxious to reassure him that it was all right, but these outrages— "You cannot have an omelet," said Asano, "without breaking eggs. It is only the rough people, only in one part of the city. All the rest is all right. The Parisian laborers are the wildest in the world, except ours." "What, the Londoners?" "No, the Japanese. They have to be kept in order." "But burning women alive—" "A commune," said Asano. "They would rob you of your property." "They would do away with property and give the world over to mob rule. You are master. The world is yours. But there will be no commune here. There is no need for black police here. And every consideration has been shown. It is their own Negroes, French-speaking Negroes. Senegal regiments and Niger and Timbuktu." "Regiments," said Graham. "I thought there was only one." "No," said Asano and glanced at him. "There is more than one." Graham felt unpleasantly helpless. "I did not think," he began and stopped abruptly. He went off at a tangent to ask for information about these Babel machines. For the most part, the crowd present had been shabbily or even raggedly dressed, and Graham learnt that so far as the more prosperous classes were concerned, in all the more comfortable private apartments of the city were fixed Babel machines that would speak directly. A lever was pulled. The tenant of the apartment could connect this with the cables of any of the great news syndicates that he preferred. When he learned this presently, he demanded the reason of their absence from his own suite of apartments. Asano stared. "I never thought," he said. "Ostrog must have had them removed." Graham stared. "How was I to know?" he exclaimed. "Perhaps he thought they would annoy you," said Asano. "They must be replaced directly I return," said Graham after an interval. He found a difficulty in understanding that this newsroom and the dining hall were not great central places, that such establishments were repeated, almost beyond counting, all over the city. But ever and again during the night's expedition his ears, in some new quarter, would pick out from the tumult of the ways the peculiar hooting of the organ of Boss Ostrog. "Gallop, gallop!" or the shrill "Yaha, yaha, yak!" Here a live paper yelp of its chief rival. Repeated, too, everywhere, were such crèches as the one he now entered. It was reached by a lift, and by a glass bridge that flung across the dining hall and traversed the ways at a slight upward angle. To enter the first section of the place necessitated the use of his solvent signature under Asano's direction. They were immediately attended to by a man in a violet robe and gold clasp, the insignia of practicing medical men. He perceived from this man's manner that his identity was known, and proceeded to ask questions on the strange arrangements of the place without reserve. On either side of the passage, which was silent and padded, as if to deaden the footfall, were narrow little doors, their size and arrangement suggestive of the cells of a Victorian prison. But the upper portion of each door was of the same greenish transparent stuff that had enclosed him at his awakening, and within, dimly seen, lay in every case a very young baby in a little nest of wadding. Elaborate apparatus watched the atmosphere and rang a bell far away in the central office at the slightest departure from the optimum of temperature and moisture. A system of such crèches had almost entirely replaced the hazardous adventures of the old world nursing. The attendant presently called Graham's attention to the wet nurses, a vista of mechanical figures with arms, shoulders, and breasts of astonishingly realistic modeling, articulation, and texture, but mere brass tripods below, and having in the place of features a flat disc bearing advertisements likely to be of interest to mothers. Of all the strange things that Graham came upon that night, none jarred more upon his habits of thought than this place. The spectacle of the little pink creatures, their feeble limbs swaying uncertainly in vague first movements, left alone, without embrace or endearment, was wholly repugnant to him. The attendant doctor was of a different opinion. His statistical evidence showed beyond dispute that in the Victorian times the most dangerous passage of life was the arms of the mother, that their human mortality had ever been most terrible. On the other hand, this crèche company, the International Crèche Syndicate, lost not 0.5% of the million babies or so that formed its peculiar care. But Graham's prejudice was too strong even for those figures. Along one of the many passages of the place they presently came upon a young couple in the usual blue canvas peering through the transparency and laughing hysterically at the bald head of their firstborn. Graham's face must have showed his estimate of them, for their merriment ceased and they looked abashed. But this little incident accentuated his sudden realization of the gulf between his habits of thought and the ways of the new age. He passed on to the crawling rooms and the kindergarten, perplexed and distressed. He found the endless long playrooms were empty. The latter-day children, at least, still spent their nights in sleep. As they went through these, the little officer pointed out the nature of the toys, developments of those devised by that inspired sentimentalist Froebel. There were nurses here, but much was done by machines that sang and danced and danned. Graham was still not clear upon many points. But so many orphans, he said perplexed, reverting to a first misconception, and learnt again that they were not orphans. So soon as they had left the crèche, he began to speak of the horror the babies in their incubating cases had caused him. "Is motherhood gone?" he said. "Was it a cant? Surely it was an instinct. This seems so unnatural, abominable almost." "Along here we shall come to the dancing place," said Asano by way of reply. "It is sure to be crowded. In spite of all the political unrest it will be crowded. The women take no great interest in politics, except a few here and there. You will see the mothers. Most young women in London are mothers. In that class it is considered a creditable thing to have one child, a proof of animation. Few middle-class people have more than one. With the Labour Company it is different. As for motherhood, they still take an immense pride in the children. They come here to look at them quite often." Then do you mean that the population of the world is falling? Yes. Except among the people under the labor company, they are reckless. The air was suddenly dancing with music, and down a way they approached obliquely, set with gorgeous pillars as it seemed of clear amethyst, flowed a concourse of gay people and a tumult of merry cries and laughter. He saw curled heads, wreathed brows, and a happy, intricate flutter of gamboge pass triumphant across the picture. "You will see," said Asano with a faint smile. "The world has changed. In a moment, you will see the mothers of the new age. Come this way. We shall see those yonder again very soon." They ascended a certain height in a swift lift and changed to a slower one. As they went on, the music grew upon them until it was near and full and splendid, and, moving with its glorious intricacies, they could distinguish the beat of innumerable dancing feet. They made a payment at a turnstile and emerged upon the wide gallery that overlooked the dancing place and upon the full enchantment of sound and sight. "Here," said Asano, "are the fathers and mothers of the little ones you saw." The hall was not so richly decorated as that of the Atlas, but saving that it was, for its size, the most splendid Graham had seen. The beautiful white-limbed figures that supported the galleries reminded him once more of the restored magnificence of sculpture. They seemed to writhe in engaging attitudes, their faces laughed. The source of the music that filled the place was hidden, and the whole vast shining floor was thick with dancing couples. "Look at them," said the little officer. "See how much they show of motherhood." The gallery they stood upon ran along the upper edge of a huge screen that cut the dancing hall on one side from a sort of outer hall that showed through broad arches the incessant onward rush of the city ways. In this outer hall was a great crowd of less brilliantly dressed people, as numerous almost as those who danced within, the great majority wearing the blue uniform of the labor company that was now so familiar to Graham. Too poor to pass the turnstiles to the festival, they were yet unable to keep away from the sound of its seductions. Some of them even had cleared spaces and were dancing also, fluttering their rags in the air. Some shouted as they danced, jests and odd allusions Graham did not understand. Once someone began whistling the refrain of the revolutionary song, but it seemed as though that beginning was promptly suppressed. The corner was dark and Graham could not see. He turned to the hall again. Above the caryatide were marble busts of men whom that age esteemed great moral emancipators and pioneers. For the most part their names were strange to Graham, though he recognized Grant Allen, Le Gallienne, Nietzsche, Shelley, and Goodwin. Great black festoons and eloquent sentiments reinforced the huge inscription that partially defaced the upper end of the dancing place and asserted that the festival of the awakening was in progress. Myriads are taking holiday or staying from work because of that, quite apart from the laborers who refuse to go back, said Asano. These people are always ready for holidays. Graham walked to the parapet and stood leaning over, looking down at the dancers. Save for 2 or 3 remote whispering couples, who had stolen apart, he and his guide had the gallery to themselves. A warm breath of scent and vitality came up to him. Both men and women below were lightly clad, bare-armed, open-necked, as the universal warmth of the city permitted. The hair of the men was often a mass of effeminate curls. Their chins were always shaven, and many of them had flushed or colored cheeks. Many of the women were very pretty, and all were dressed with elaborate coquetry. As they swept by beneath, he saw ecstatic faces with eyes half closed in pleasure. "What sort of people are these?" he asked abruptly. "Workers, prosperous workers, which you would have called the middle class. Independent tradesmen with little separate businesses have vanished long ago, but there are store servers, managers, engineers of 100 sorts. Tonight is a holiday, of course, and every dancing place in the city will be crowded, and every place of worship. But the women? The same. There's 1,000 forms of work for women now. But you had the beginning of the independent working woman in your days. Most women are independent now. Most of these are married more or less. There are a number of methods of contract, and that gives them more money and enables them to enjoy themselves. I see, said Graham, looking at the flushed faces, the flash and swirl of movement, and still thinking of that nightmare of pink helpless limbs. And these are mothers. Most of them. The more I see of these things, the more complex I find your problems. This, for instance, is a surprise. That news from Paris was a surprise. In a little while he spoke again. These are mothers. Presently, I suppose, I shall get into the modern way of seeing things. I have old habits of mind clinging about me, habits based, I suppose, on needs that are over and done with. Of course, in our time, a woman was supposed not only to bear children, but to cherish them, to devote herself to them, to educate them all the essentials of moral and mental education. A child owed its mother, or went without. Quite a number, I admit, went without. Nowadays, clearly, there is no more need for such care than if they were butterflies. I see that. Only there was an ideal, that figure of a grave, patient woman, silently and serenely mistress of a home, mother and maker of men to love her, was a sort of worship. He stopped and repeated, a sort of worship. Ideals change, said the little man, as needs change. Graham awoke from an instant reverie, and Asano repeated his words. Graham's mind returned to the thing at hand. Of course I see the perfect reasonableness of this restraint, soberness, the matured thought, the unselfish act. They are necessities of the barbarous state, the life of dangers. Dourness is man's tribute to unconquered nature. But man has conquered nature now for all practical purposes. His political affairs are managed by bosses with the black police, and life is joyous. He looked at the dancers again. Joyous, he said. There are weary moments, said the little officer reflectively. They all look young. Down there I should be visibly the oldest man, and in my own time I should have passed as middle-aged. They are young. There are few old people in this class in the work cities. How is that? Old people's lives are not so pleasant as they used to be, unless they are rich to hire lovers and helpers, and we have an institution called euthanasia. Ha! That euthanasia, said Graham. The easy death, the easy death. It is the last pleasure. The euthanasia company does it well. People will pay the sum. It is a costly thing long beforehand. Go off to some pleasure city and return impoverished and weary, very weary. There is a lot left for me to understand, said Graham after a pause. Yet I see. The logic of it all. Our array of angry virtues and sour restraints was the consequence of danger and insecurity. The Stoic, the Puritan, even in my time, were vanishing types. In the old days man was armed against pain. Now he is eager for pleasure. There lies the difference. Civilization has driven pain and danger so far off for well-to-do people, and only well-to-do people matter now. I had been asleep 200 years. For a minute they leant on the balustrading, following the intricate evolution of the dance. Indeed, the scene was very beautiful. Before God, said Graham suddenly, I would rather be a wounded sentinel freezing in the snow than one of these painted fools. In the snow, said Asano. one might think differently. I am uncivilized, said Graham, not heeding him. That is the trouble. I am. Primitive Paleolithic. Their fountain of rage and fear and anger is sealed and closed. The habits of a lifetime make them cheerful and easy and delightful. You must bear with my 19th century shocks and disgusts. These people, you say, are skilled workers, and so forth. And while bees dance, men are dying in Paris to keep the world that they may dance. Asano smiled faintly. For that matter, men are dying in London, he said. There was a moment's silence. Where do these sleep? Asked Graham. Above and below an intricate warren. And where do they work? This is the domestic life. You will see little work tonight. Half the workers are out or under arms. Half. These people are keeping holiday, but we will go to the workplaces if you wish it. For a time, Graham watched the dancers, then suddenly turned away. I want to see the workers. I have seen enough of these, he said. Asano led the way along the gallery across the dancing hall. Presently they came to a transverse passage that brought a breath of fresher, colder air. Asano glanced at this passage as they went past, stopped, went back to it, and turned to Graham with a smile. Here, sire, he said, is something will be familiar to you at least, and yet, but I will not tell you. Come. He led the way along a closed passage that presently became cold. The reverberation of their feet told that this passage was a bridge. They came into a circular gallery that was glazed in from the outer weather, and so reached a circular chamber which seemed familiar, though Graham could not recall distinctly when he had entered it before. In this was a ladder, the first ladder he had seen since his awakening up, which they went, and came into a high, dark, cold place, in which was another, almost vertical ladder. This they ascended, Graham still perplexed, but at the top he understood and recognized the metallic bars to which he clung. He was in the cage under the ball of St. Paul's. The dome rose but a little way above the general contour of the city, into the still twilight, and sloped away, shining greasily under a few distant lights into a circumambient ditch of darkness. Out between the bars he looked upon the wind-clear northern sky and saw the starry constellations all unchanged. Capella hung in the west, Vega was rising, and the 7 glittering points of the Great Bear swept overhead in their stately circle about the pole. He saw these stars in a clear gap of sky. To the east and south, the great circular shapes of complaining wind wheels blotted out the heavens so that the glare about the council house was hidden. To the southwest hung Orion, showing like a pallid ghost through a tracery of ironwork and interlacing shapes above a dazzling coruscation of lights. A bellowing and siren screaming that came from the flying stages warned the world that one of the aeroplanes was ready to start. He remained for a space gazing towards the glaring stage. Then his eyes went back to the northward constellations. For a long time he was silent. This, he said at last, smiling in the shadow, seems the strangest thing of all, to stand in the dome of St. Paul's and look once more upon these familiar, silent stars. Thence Graham was taken by Asano along devious ways to the great gambling and business quarters where the bulk of the fortunes in the city were lost and made. It impressed him as a well-nigh interminable series of very high halls, surrounded by tiers upon tiers of galleries, into which opened thousands of offices, and traversed by a complicated multitude of bridges, footways, aerial motor rails, and trapeze and cable leaps. And here, more than anywhere, the note of vehement vitality, of uncontrollable, hasty activity, rose high. Everywhere was violent advertisement, until his brain swam at the tumult of light and color. and babble machines of a peculiarly rancid tone were abundant and filled the air with strenuous squealing and an idiotic slang. Skin your eyes and slide. Choo-whoop bonanza. Gallopers come and hark. The place seemed to him to be dense, with people either profoundly agitated or swelling with obscure cunning. Yet he learned that the place was comparatively empty, that the great political convulsion of the last few days had reduced transactions to an unprecedented minimum. In one huge place were long avenues of roulette tables, each with an excited, undignified crowd about it, and another a yelping babble of white-faced women and red-necked, leathery-lunged men bought and sold the shares of an absolutely fictitious business undertaking which, every 5 minutes, paid a dividend of 10% and canceled a certain proportion of its shares by means of a lottery wheel. These business activities were prosecuted with an energy that readily passed into violence, and Graham, approaching a dense crowd, found at its center a couple of prominent merchants in violent controversy with teeth and nails on some delicate point of business etiquette. Something still remained in life to be fought for. Further, he had a shock at a vehement announcement in phonetic letters of scarlet flame, each twice the height of a man, that W. assures the proprietor, W. assures the proprietor, W. assures the proprietor. "Who's the proprietor?" he asked. "You. But what do they assure me?" he asked. "What do they assure me? Didn't you have assurance?" Graham thought. Insurance? Yes, insurance. I remember that was the older word. They are insuring your life. Dozens of people are taking out policies. Myriads of lions are being put on you. And further on, other people are buying annuities. They do that on everybody who is at all prominent. Look there. A crowd of people surged and roared, and Graham saw a vast black screen suddenly illuminated in still larger letters of burning purple. Unwaities on the proprietor X5 Prey, G. The people began to boo and shout at this. A number of hard-breathing, wild-eyed men came running past, clawing with hooked fingers at the air. There was a furious crush about a little doorway. Asano did a brief calculation. 17% per annum is their annuity on you. They would not pay so much % if they could see you now, sire. But they do not know. Your own annuities used to be a very safe investment, but now you are sheer gambling, of course. This is probably a desperate bid. I doubt if people will get their money. The crowd of would-be annuitants grew so thick about them that for some time they could move neither forward nor backward. Graham noticed what appeared to him to be a high proportion of women among the speculators, and was reminded again of the economical independence of their sex. They seemed remarkably well able to take care of themselves in the crowd, using their elbows with particular skill, as he learnt to his cost. One curly-headed person, caught in the pressure for a space, looked steadfastly at him several times, almost as if she recognized him, and then, edging deliberately towards him, touched his hand with her arm in a scarcely accidental manner, and made it plain by a look as ancient as Chaldea that he had found favor in her eyes. And then a lank, gray-bearded man, perspiring copiously in the noble passion of self-help, blind to all earthly things save that glaring bait thrust between them in a cataclysmal rush towards that alluring X5 prey. "Gee, I want to get out of this," said Graham to Asano. "This is not what I came to see. Show me the workers. I want to see the people in blue. These parasitic lunatics." He found himself wedged in a struggling mass of people, and this hopeful sentence went unfinished. Chapter 21. The Underside. From the business quarter they presently passed by the running ways into a remote quarter of the city, where the bulk of the manufactures was done. On their way the platforms crossed the Thames twice and passed in a broad viaduct across one of the great roads that entered the city from the north. In both cases his impression was swift and in both very vivid. The river was a broad wrinkled glitter of black sea water, overarched by buildings, and vanishing either way into a blackness starred with receding lights. A string of black barges passed seaward, manned by blue-clad men. The road was a long and very broad and high tunnel, along which big-wheeled machines drove noiselessly and swiftly. Here, too, the distinctive blue of the Labor Company was in abundance. The smoothness of the double tracks, the largeness and the lightness of the big pneumatic wheels in proportion to the vehicular body struck Graham most vividly. One lank and very high carriage with longitudinal metallic rods hung with the dripping carcasses of many hundred sheep arrested his attention unduly. Abruptly, the edge of the archway cut and blotted out the picture. Presently they left the way and descended by a lift and traversed a passage that sloped downward, and so came to a descending lift again. The appearance of things changed. Even the pretense of architectural ornament disappeared. The lights diminished in number and size. The architecture became more and more massive in proportion to the spaces as the factory quarters were reached. And in the dusty biscuit-making place of the potters, among the felspar mills in the furnace rooms of the metal workers, among the incandescent lakes of crude adamite, the blue canvas clothing was on man, woman, and child. Many of these great and dusty galleries were silent avenues of machinery. Endless raked-out ashen furnaces testified to the revolutionary dislocation, but wherever there was work, it was being done by slow-moving workers in blue canvas. The only people not in blue canvas were the overlookers of the work. Places and the orange-clad labor police, and fresh from the flushed faces of the dancing halls, the voluntary vigors of the business quarter, Graham could note the pinched faces, the feeble muscles, and weary eyes of many of the latter-day workers. Such as he saw at work were noticeably inferior in physique to the few gaily dressed managers and forewomen who were directing their labors. The burly laborers of the Victorian times had followed the dray horse and all such living force producers to extinction. The place of his costly muscles was taken by some dexterous machine. The latter-day laborer, male as well as female, was essentially a machine minder and feeder, a servant and attendant, or an artist under direction. The women, in comparison with those Graham remembered, were as a class distinctly plain and flat-chested. 200 years of emancipation from the moral restraints of puritanical religion, 200 years of city life, had done their work in eliminating the strain of feminine beauty and vigor from the blue. Canvas myriads. To be brilliant physically or mentally, to be in any way attractive or exceptional, had been and was still a certain way of emancipation to the drudge, a line of escape to the pleasure city and its splendors and delights, and at last to the euthanasia and peace. To be steadfast against such inducements was scarcely to be expected of meanly nourished souls. In the young cities of Graham's former life, the newly aggregated laboring mass had been a diverse multitude, still stirred by the tradition of personal honor and a high morality. Now it was differentiating into a distinct class with a moral and physical difference of its own, even with a dialect of its own. They penetrated downward, ever downward, towards the working places. Presently they passed underneath one of the streets of the moving ways, and saw its platforms running on their rails far overhead, and chinks of white lights between the transverse slits. The factories that were not working were sparsely lighted. To Graham, they and their shrouded aisles of giant machines seemed plunged in gloom, And even where work was going on, the illumination was far less brilliant than upon the public ways. Beyond the blazing lakes of Edomite, he came to the warren of the jewelers, and, with some difficulty and by using his signature, obtained admission to these galleries. They were high and dark and rather cold. In the first a few men were making ornaments of gold filigree, each man at a little bench by himself and with a little shaded light. The long vista of light patches, with the nimble fingers brightly lit and moving among the gleaming yellow coils, and the intent face like the face of a ghost in each shadow, had the oddest effect. The work was beautifully executed, but without any strength of modeling or drawing, for the most part intricate grotesques or the ringing of the changes on a geometrical motif. These workers wore a peculiar white uniform without pockets or sleeves. They assumed this on coming to work, but at night they were stripped and examined before they left the premises of the company. In spite of every precaution, the labor policeman told them in a depressed tone. The company was not infrequently robbed. Beyond was a gallery of women busied in cutting and setting slabs of artificial ruby, and next these were men and women busy together upon the slabs of copper net that formed the bases of Quaison tiles. Many of these workers had lips and nostrils a livid white due to a disease caused by a peculiar purple enamel that chanced to be much in fashion. Asano apologized to Graham for the offense of their faces, but excused himself on the score of the convenience of this route. "This is what I wanted to see," said Graham. "This is what I wanted to see," trying to avoid a start at a particularly striking disfigurement that suddenly stared him in the face. "She might have done better with herself than that," said Asano. Graham made some indignant comments. "But sire, we simply could not stand that stuff without the purple," said Asano. "In your days people could stand such crudities. They were nearer the barbaric by 200 years. They continued along one of the lower galleries of this Quosene factory and came to a little bridge that spanned a vault. Looking over the parapet, Graham saw that beneath was a wharf under yet more tremendous archings than any he had seen. 3 barges, smothered in floury dust, were being unloaded of their cargoes of powdered feldspar by a multitude of coughing men, each guiding a little truck. The dust filled the place with a choking mist and turned the electric glare yellow. The vague shadows of these workers gesticulated about their feet and rushed to and fro against a long stretch of whitewashed wall. Every now and then one would stop to cough. A shadowy, huge mass of masonry rising out of the inky water brought to Graham's mind the thought of the multitude of ways and galleries and lifts that rose floor above floor overhead between him and the sky. The men worked in silence under the supervision of 2 of the labor police. Their feet made a hollow thunder on the planks along which they went to and fro. And as he looked at the scene, some hidden voice in the darkness began to sing. "Stop that!" shouted one of the policemen. But the order was disobeyed, and first one and then all the white-stained men who were working there had taken up the beating refrain, singing it defiantly, the song of the revolt. The feet upon the planks thundered now to the rhythm of the song, tramp, tramp, tramp. The policeman who had shouted glanced at his fellow, and Graham saw him shrug his shoulders. He made no further effort to stop the singing. And so they went through these factories and places of toil, seeing many painful and grim things, but why should the gentle reader be depressed? Surely to a refined nature our present world is distressing enough without bothering ourselves about these miseries to come. We shall not suffer anyhow. Our children may, but what is that to us? That walk left on Graham's mind a maze of memories, fluctuating pictures of swathed halls and crowded vaults seen through clouds of dust, of intricate machines, the racing threads of looms, the heavy beat of stamping machinery, the roar and rattle of belt and armature, of ill-lit subterranean aisles of sleeping places, illimitable vistas of pinning lights, and here the reek of a brewery, and here unprecedented reeks. And everywhere were pillars and cross-archings of such a massiveness as Graham had never before seen. Thick titans of greasy, shining brickwork crushed beneath the vast weight of that complex city world, even as these anemic millions were crushed by its complexity. And everywhere were pale features, lean limbs, disfigurement, and degradation. Once and again a third time, Graham heard the song of the revolt during his long, unpleasant research in these places, and once he saw a confused struggle down a passage, and learned that a number of these serfs had seized their bread before their work was done. Graham was ascending towards the ways again, when he saw a number of blue-clad children running down a transverse passage, and presently perceived the reason of their panic in a company of the labor police armed with clubs, trotting towards some unknown disturbance. And then came a remote disorder, but for the most part this remnant that worked hopelessly. All the spirit that was left in fallen humanity was above in the streets that night, calling for the master, and valiantly and noisily keeping its arms. They emerged from these wanderings and stood blinking in the bright light of the middle passage of the platforms again. They became aware of the remote hooting and yelping of the machines of one of the General Intelligence offices, and suddenly came men running, and along the platforms and about the ways. Everywhere was a shouting and crying. Then a woman with a face of mute white terror, and another who gasped and shrieked as she ran. "What has happened now?" said Graham, puzzled, for he could not understand their thick speech. Then he heard it in English and perceived that the thing that everyone was shouting, that men yelled to one another, that women took up screaming, that was passing like the first breeze of a thunderstorm, chill and sudden through the city, was this: Ostrog has ordered the black police to London. The black police are coming from South Africa. The black police! The black police! Asano's face was white and astonished. He hesitated, looked at Graham's face, and told him the thing he already knew. "But how can they know?" asked Asano. Graham heard someone shouting, "Stop all work! Stop all work!" And a swarthy hunchback, ridiculously gay in green and gold, came leaping down the platforms. Toward him, bawling again and again in good English, "This is Ostrog's doing, Ostrog the knave. The master is betrayed." His voice was hoarse, and a thin foam dropped from his ugly shouting mouth. He yelled in unspeakable horror that the black police had done in Paris, and so passed shrieking, "Ostrog the knave." For a moment Graham stood still, for it had come upon him again that these things were a dream. He looked up at the great cliff of buildings on either side, vanishing into blue haze at last above the lights, and down to the roaring tiers of platforms and the shouting, running people who were gesticulating past. "The master is betrayed," they cried. "The master is betrayed." Suddenly the situation shaped itself in his mind real and urgent. His heart began to beat fast and strong. "It has come," he said. "I might have known. The hour has come." He thought swiftly. "What am I to do?" "Go back to the council house," said Asano. "Why should I not appeal? The people are here." "You will lose time. They will doubt if it is you. But they will mass about the council house. There you will find their leaders. Your strength is there with them. Suppose this is only a rumor." "It sounds true," said Asano. "Let us have the facts," said Graham. Asano shrugged his shoulders. "We had better get towards the council house," he cried. "That is where they will swarm. Even now the ruins may be impassable." Graham regarded him doubtfully and followed him. They went up the stepped platforms to the swiftest one, and there Asano accosted a laborer. The answers to his questions were in the thick, vulgar speech. "What did he say?" asked Graham. He knows little, but he told me that the black police would have arrived here before the people knew, had not someone in the wind vane offices learnt. He said a girl. A girl. Not, he said a girl he did not know who she was, who came out from the council house, crying aloud and told the men at work among the ruins. And then another thing was shouted, something that turned an aimless tumult into determinate movements. It came like a wind along the street. To your wards, to your wards, every man get arms, every man to his ward. Chapter 22. The Estargle in the Conkles. As Asano and Graham hurried along to the ruins about the council house, they saw everywhere the excitement of the people rising. To your wards, to your wards. Everywhere men and women in blue were hurrying from unknown subterranean employments, up the staircases of the middle path at one place. Graham saw an arsenal of the Revolutionary Committee besieged by a crowd of shouting men, at another a couple of men in the hated yellow uniform of the labor police, pursued by a gathering crowd, fled precipitately along the swift way that went in the opposite direction. The cries of "To your wards" became at last a continuous shouting as they drew near the government quarter. Many of the shouts were unintelligible. "Ostrog has betrayed us," one man bawled in a hoarse voice again and again, dinning that refrain into Graham's ear until it haunted him. This person stayed close beside Graham and Asano on the swift way, shouting to the people who swarmed on the lower platforms as he rushed past them. His cry about Ostrog alternated with some incomprehensible orders. Presently he went leaping down and disappeared. Graham's mind was filled with the din. His plans were vague and unformed. He had one picture of some commanding position from which he could address the multitudes, another of meeting Ostrog face to face. He was full of rage, of tense muscular excitement, his hands gripped, his lips were pressed together. The way to the council house across the ruins was impassable, but Asano met that difficulty and took Graham into the premises of the Central Post Office. The post office was nominally at work, but the blue-clothed porters moved sluggishly or had stopped to stare through the arches of their galleries at the shouting men who were going by outside. Every man to his ward, every man to his ward. Here, by Asano's advice, Graham revealed his identity. They crossed to the council house by a cable cradle, already in the brief. Interval. Since the capitulation of the councillors, a great change had been wrought in the appearance of the ruins. The spurting cascades of the ruptured seawater mains had been captured and tamed, and huge temporary pipes ran overhead along a flimsy-looking fabric of girders. The sky was laced with restored cables and wires that served the council house, and a mass of new fabric, with cranes and other building machines going to and fro upon it, projected to the left of the white pile. The moving ways that ran across this area had been restored, albeit for once running under the open sky. These were the ways that Graham had seen from the little balcony in the hour of his awakening, not 9 days since, and the hall of his trance had been on the further side, where now shapeless piles of smashed and shattered masonry were heaped together. It was already high day and the sun was shining brightly. Out of their tall caverns of blue electric light came the swift ways crowded with multitudes of people, who poured off them and gathered ever denser over the wreckage and confusion of the ruins. The air was full of their shouting, and they were pressing and swaying towards the central building. For the most part, that shouting mass consisted of shapeless swarms, but here and there Graham could see that a rude discipline struggled to establish itself, and every voice clamored for order in the chaos. To your wards, every man to his ward. The cable carried them into a hall which Graham recognized as the antechamber to the hall of the Atlas, about the gallery of which he had walked days ago with Howard, to show himself to the vanished council an hour from his awakening. Now the place was empty except for 2 cable attendants. These men seemed hugely astonished to recognize the sleeper in the man who swung down from the cross seat. "Where is Helen Wotton?" he demanded. "Where is Helen Wotton?" They did not know. "Then where is Ostrog? I must see Ostrog. I must see Ostrog forthwith. He has disobeyed me. I have come back to take things out of his hands." Without waiting for Asano, he went straight across the place, ascended the steps at the further end, and, pulling the curtain aside, found himself facing the perpetually bearing Titan. The hall was empty. Its appearance had changed very greatly since his first sight of it. It had suffered serious injury in the violent struggle of the first outbreak. On the right-hand side of the great figure, the upper half of the wall had been torn away for nearly 200 feet of its length, and a sheet of the same glassy film that had enclosed Graham at his awakening had been drawn across the gap. This deadened, but did not altogether exclude the roar of the people outside. "Wards! Wards! Wards!" they seemed to be saying. Through it there were visible the beams and supports of metal scaffoldings that rose and fell according to the requirements of a great crowd of workmen. An idle building machine with lank arms of red-painted metal that caught the still plastic blocks of mineral paste and swung them neatly into position stretched gauntly across this green-tinted picture. On it were still a number of workmen staring at the crowd below. For a moment he stood regarding these things, and Asano overtook him. "Ostrog," said Asano, "will be in the small offices beyond there." The little man looked livid now, and his eyes searched Graham's face. They had scarcely advanced 10 paces from the curtain before a little panel to the left of the Atlas rolled up, and Ostrog, accompanied by Lincoln and followed by 2 black and yellow clad Negroes, appeared crossing the remote corner of the hall towards the second panel that was raised and open. "Ostrog!" shouted Graham, and at the sound of his voice the little party turned astonished. Ostrog said something to Lincoln and advanced alone. Graham was the first to speak. His voice was loud and dictatorial. "What is this I hear?" he asked. "Are you bringing Negroes here to keep the people down?" "It is none too soon," said Ostrog. "They have been getting out of hand more and more since the revolt." "I underestimated. Do you mean that these infernal Negroes are on the way?" "On the way. As it is, you have seen the people outside? No wonder. But after what was said, you have taken too much on yourself, Ostrog." Ostrog said nothing but drew nearer. "These Negroes must not come to London," said Graham. "I am master and they." "Shall not come." Ostrog glanced at Lincoln, who at once came towards them with his 2 attendants close behind him. "Why not?" asked Ostrog. "White men must be mastered by white men. Besides, the Negroes are only an instrument, but that is not the question. I am the master. I mean to be the master. And I tell you these Negroes shall not come. The people, I believe in the people, because you are an anachronism. You are a man out of the past, an accident. You are owner, perhaps, of half the property in the world, but you are not master. You do not know enough to be master." He glanced at Lincoln again. "I know now what you think. I can guess something of what you mean to do. Even now it is not too late to warn you. You dream of human equality, of a socialistic order. You have all those worn-out dreams of the 19th century, fresh and vivid in your mind, and you would rule this age that you do not understand." "Listen," said Graham. "You can hear it a sound like the sea. Not voices, but a voice. Do you altogether understand?" "We taught them that," said Ostrog. "Perhaps. Can you teach them to forget it? But enough of this. These Negroes must not come." There was a pause, and Ostrog looked him in the eyes. "They will," he said. "I forbid it," said Graham. "They have started. I will not have it." "No," said Ostrog, "sorry as I am to follow the method of the council. For your own good you must not side with disorder. And now that you are here, it was kind of you to come here." Lincoln laid his hand on Graham's shoulder. Abruptly, Graham realized the enormity of his blunder in coming to the council house. He turned towards the curtains that separated the hall from the antechamber. The clutching hand of Asano intervened. In another moment, Lincoln had grasped Graham's cloak. He turned and struck at Lincoln's face, and incontinently a Negro had him by collar and arm. He wrenched himself away. His sleeve tore noisily, and he stumbled back, to be tripped by the other attendant. Then he struck the ground heavily, and he was staring at the distant ceiling of the hall. He shouted, rolled over, struggling fiercely, clutched an attendant's leg and threw him headlong, and struggled to his feet. Lincoln appeared before him, went down heavily again with a blow under the point of the jaw, and lay still. Graham made 2 strides, stumbled, and then Ostrog's arm was round his neck. He was pulled over backward, fell heavily, and his arms were pinned to the ground. After a few violent efforts, he ceased to struggle and lay staring at Ostrog's heaving throat. "You are a prisoner," panted Ostrog, exulting. "You were rather a fool to come back." Graham turned his head about and perceived through the irregular green window in the walls of the hall the men who had been working the building cranes, gesticulating excitedly to the people below them. They had seen. Ostrog followed his eyes and started. He shouted something to Lincoln, but Lincoln did not move. A bullet smashed among the moldings above the Atlas. The 2 sheets of transparent matter that had been stretched across this gap were rent. The edges of the torn aperture darkened, curved, ran rapidly towards the framework, and in a moment the council chamber stood open to the air. A chilly gust blew in by the gap, bringing with it a war of voices from the ruinous spaces without, an elvish babblement. "Save the master! What are they doing to the master? The master is betrayed." And then he realized that Ostrog's attention was distracted, that Ostrog's grip had relaxed, and, wrenching his arms free, he struggled to his knees. In another moment he had thrust Ostrog back, and he was on one foot, his hand gripping Ostrog's throat, and Ostrog's hands clutching the silk about his neck. But now men were coming towards them from the daysmen whose intentions he misunderstood. He had a glimpse of someone running in the distance towards the curtains of the antechamber, and then Ostrog had slipped from him, and these newcomers were upon him. To his infinite astonishment, they seized him. They obeyed the shouts of Ostrog. He was lugged a dozen yards before he realized that they were not friends, that they were dragging him towards the open panel. When he saw this, he pulled back. He tried to fling himself down. He shouted for help with all his strength, and this time there were answering cries. The grip upon his neck relaxed, and behold, in the lower corner of the rent upon the wall, first one and then a number of little black figures appeared. Shouting and waving arms, they came leaping down from the gap into the light gallery that had led to the silent rooms. They ran along it. So near were they that Graham could see the weapons in their hands. Then Ostrog was shouting in his ear to the men who held him, and once more he was struggling with all his strength against their endeavors to thrust him towards the opening that yawned to receive him. "They can't come down," panted Ostrog. "They daren't fire. It's all right. We'll save him from them yet." For long minutes, as it seemed to Graham, that inglorious struggle continued. His clothes were rent in a dozen places. He was covered in dust. One hand had been trodden upon. He could hear the shouts of his supporters, and once he heard shots. He could feel his strength giving way, feel his efforts wild and aimless. But no help came, and surely, irresistibly, that black yawning opening came nearer. The pressure upon him relaxed and he struggled up. He saw Ostrog's gray head receding and perceived that he was no longer held. He turned about and came full into a man in black. One of the green weapons cracked close to him. A drift of pungent smoke came into his face and a steel blade flashed. The huge chamber span about him. He saw a man in pale blue stabbing one of the black and yellow attendants not 3 yards from his face. Then hands were upon him again. He was being pulled in 2 directions now. It seemed as though people were shouting to him. He wanted to understand and could not. Someone was clutching about his thighs. He was being hoisted in spite of his vigorous efforts. He understood suddenly. He ceased to struggle. He was lifted up on men's shoulders and carried away from that devouring panel. 10,000 throats were cheering. He saw men in blue and black hurrying after the retreating Ostrogites and firing. Lifted up, he saw now across the whole expanse of the hall beneath the Atlas image, saw that he was being carried towards the raised platform in the center of the place. The far end of the hall was already full of people running towards him. They were looking at him and cheering. He became aware that a sort of bodyguard surrounded him. Active men about him shouted vague orders. He saw close at hand the black-mustached man in yellow who had been among those who had greeted him in the public theater, shouting directions. The hall was already densely packed with swaying people. The little metal gallery sagged with the shouting load. The curtains at the end had been torn away, and the antechamber was revealed densely crowded. He could scarcely make the man near him hear for the tumult about them. "Where has Ostrog gone?" he asked. The man he questioned pointed over the heads towards the lower panels, about the hall on the side opposite the gap. They stood open, and armed men, blue-clad with black sashes, were running through them and vanishing into the chambers and passages beyond. It seemed to Graham that a sound of firing drifted through the riot. He was carried in a staggering curve across the great hall towards an opening beneath the gap. He perceived men working with a sort of rude discipline to keep the crowd off him, to make a space clear about him. He passed out of the hall and saw a crude, new wall rising blankly before him, topped by blue sky. He was swung down to his feet. Someone gripped his arm and guided him. He found the man in yellow close at hand. They were taking him up a narrow stairway of brick, and close at hand rose the great red painted masses, the cranes and levers, and the still engines of the big building machine. He was at the top of the steps. He was hurried across a narrow railed footway, and suddenly, with a vast shouting, the amphitheater of ruins opened again before him. "The Master is with us! The Master! The Master!" The shout swept athwart the lake of faces like a wave, broke against the distant cliff of ruins, and came back in a welter of cries. "The Master is on our side!" Graham perceived that he was no longer encompassed by people, that he was standing upon a little temporary platform of white metal, part of a flimsy-seeming scaffolding that laced about the great mass of the council house. Over all the huge expanse of the ruins swayed and eddied the shouting people, and here and there the black banners of the revolutionary societies ducked and swayed and formed rare nuclei of organization in the chaos. Up the steep stairs of wall and scaffolding by which his rescuers had reached the opening in the Atlas chamber clung a solid crowd, and little energetic black figures clinging to pillars and projections were strenuous to induce these congested masses to stir. Behind him, at a higher point on the scaffolding, A number of men struggled upwards with the flapping folds of a huge black standard. Through the yawning gap in the walls below him, he could look down upon the packed attentive multitudes in the Hall of the Atlas. The distant flying stages to the south came out bright and vivid, brought nearer as it seemed by an unusual translucency of the air. A solitary aeropile beat up from the central stage, as if to meet the coming aeroplanes. "What had become of Ostrog?" asked Graham, and even as he spoke he saw that all eyes were turned from him towards the crest of the Council House building. He looked also in this direction of universal attention. For a moment he saw nothing but the jagged corner of a wall hard and clear against the sky. Then in the shadow he perceived the interior of a room and recognized with a start the green and white decorations of his former prison. And coming quickly across this opened room and up to the very verge of the cliff of the ruins came a little white, clad figure, followed by two other smaller seeming figures in black and yellow. He heard the man beside him exclaim, "Ostrog," and turned to ask a question, but he never did, because of the startled exclamation of another of those who were with him, and a lank finger suddenly pointing. He looked, and behold, the aeropile that had been rising from the flying stage when last he had looked in that direction was driving towards them. The swift, steady flight was still novel enough to hold his attention. Nearer it came, growing rapidly larger and larger, until it had swept over the further edge of the ruins and into view of the dense multitudes below. It drooped across the space and rose and passed overhead, rising to clear the mass of the council house, a filmy, translucent shape with the solitary aeronaut peering down through its ribs. It vanished beyond the skyline of the ruins. Graham transferred his attention to Ostrog. He was signaling with his hands. And his attendants busy breaking down the wall beside him. In another moment the aeropile came into view again, a little thing far away, coming round in a wide curve and going slower. Then suddenly the man in yellow shouted, "What are they doing? What are the people doing? Why is Ostrog left there? Why is he not captured? They will lift him. The aeropile will lift him. Ah!" The exclamation was echoed by a shout from the ruins. The rattling sound of the green weapons drifted across the intervening gulf to Graham, and, looking down, he saw a number of black and yellow uniforms running along one of the galleries that lay open to the air below the promontory upon which Ostrog stood. They fired as they ran at men unseen, and then emerged a number of pale blue figures in pursuit. These minute fighting figures had the oddest effect. They seemed, as they ran, like little model soldiers in a toy. This queer appearance of a house cut open gave that struggle amidst furniture and passages a quality of unreality. It was perhaps 200 yards away from him, and very nearly 50 above the heads in the ruins below. The black and yellow men ran into an open archway and turned and fired a volley. One of the blue pursuers, striding forward close to the edge, flung up his arms, staggered sideways, seemed to Graham's sense to hang over the edge for several seconds, and fell headlong down. Graham saw him strike a projecting corner, fly out, head over heels, and vanish behind the red arm of the building machine. And then a shadow came between Graham and the sun. He looked up, and the sky was clear, but he knew the aeropile had passed. Ostrog had vanished. The man in yellow thrust before him, zealous and perspiring, pointing and blatant. "They are grounding!" cried the man in yellow. "They are grounding! Tell the people to fire at him. Tell them to fire at him." Graham could not understand. He heard loud voices repeating these enigmatical orders. Suddenly, over the edge of the ruins, he saw the prow of the aeropile come gliding and stop with a jerk. In a moment Graham understood that the thing had grounded in order that Ostrog might escape by it. He saw a blue haze climbing out of the gulf, perceived that the people below him were now firing up at the projecting stem. A man beside him cheered hoarsely, and he saw that the blue rebels had gained the archway that had been contested by the men in black and yellow a moment before, and were running in a continual stream along the open passage. And suddenly the arrow pile slipped over the edge of the council house and fell. It dropped, tilting at an angle of 45 degrees, and dropping so steeply that it seemed to Graham, it seemed perhaps to most of these below, that it could not possibly rise again. It fell so closely past him that he could see Ostrog clutching the guides of the seat, with his gray hair streaming, see the white-faced aeronaut wrenching over the lever that drove the engine along its guides. He heard the apprehensive vague cry of innumerable men below. Graham clutched the railing before him and gasped. The seconds seemed an age. The lower fan of the aeropile passed within an ace of touching the people, who yelled and screamed and trampled one another below. And then it rose. For a moment it looked as if it could not possibly clear the opposite cliff, and then that it could not possibly clear the wind wheel that rotated beyond. And behold, it was clear and soaring, still heeling sideways, upward, upward. Into the wind-swept sky. The suspense of the moment gave place to a fury of exasperation as the swarming people realized that Ostrog had escaped them. With belated activity they renewed their fire until the rattling wove into a roar, until the whole area became dim and blue, and the air pungent with the thin smoke of their weapons. Too late, the aeropile dwindled smaller and smaller, and curved about and swept gracefully downward to the flying stage from which it had so lately risen. Ostrog had escaped. For a while a confused babblement arose from the ruins, and then the universal attention came back to Graham, perched high among the scaffolding. He saw the faces of the people turn towards him, heard their shouts at his rescue. From the throat of the ways came the song of the revolt, spreading like a breeze across that swaying sea of men. The little group of men about him shouted congratulations on his escape. The man in yellow was close to him, with a set face and shining eyes. And the song was rising, louder and louder. Tramp, 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 tramp. Slowly the realization came of the full meaning of these things to him, the perception of the swift change in his position. Ostrog, who had stood beside him whenever he had faced that shouting multitude before, was beyond there the antagonist. There was no one to rule for him any longer. Even the people about him, the leaders and organizers of the multitude, looked to see what he would do, looked to him to act, awaited his orders. He was king indeed. His puppet reign was at an end. He was very intent to do the thing that was expected of him. His nerves and muscles were quivering, his mind was perhaps a little confused, but he felt neither fear nor anger. His hand that had been trodden upon throbbed and was. Hot. He was a little nervous about his bearing. He knew he was not afraid, but he was anxious not to seem afraid. In his former life, he had often been more excited in playing games of skill. He was desirous of immediate action. He knew he must not think too much in detail of the huge complexity of the struggle about him, lest he should be paralyzed by the sense of its intricacy. Over there, those square blue shapes, the flying stages, meant Ostrog. Against Ostrog, he was fighting for the world. Chapter 23. While the aeroplanes were coming. For a time the master of the earth was not even master of his own mind. Even his will seemed a will not his own. His own acts surprised him and were but a part of the confusion of strange experiences that poured across his being. These things were definite, The aeroplanes were coming. Helen Wotton had warned the people of their coming, and he was master of the earth. Each of these facts seemed struggling for complete possession of his thoughts. They protruded from a background of swarming halls, elevated passages, rooms jammed with ward leaders in council kinematograph and telephone rooms, and windows looking out on a seething sea of marching men. The men in yellow, and men whom he fancied were called ward leaders, were either propelling him forward or following him obediently. It was hard to tell. Perhaps they were doing a little of both. Perhaps some power unseen and unsuspected propelled them all. He was aware that he was going to make a proclamation to the people of the earth, aware of certain grandiose phrases floating in his mind as the thing he meant to say. Many little things happened, and then he found himself with the man in yellow entering a little room where this proclamation of his was to be made. This room was grotesquely latter-day in its appointments. In the center was a bright oval lit by shaded electric lights from above. The rest was in shadow, and the double finely fitting doors through which he came from the swarming hall of the Atlas made the place very still. The dead thud of these as they closed behind him, the sudden cessation of the tumult in which he had been living for hours, the quivering circle of light, the whispers and quick noiseless movements of vaguely visible attendants in the shadows, had a strange effect upon Graham. The huge ears of a phonographic mechanism gaped in a battery for his words. The black eyes of great photographic cameras awaited his beginning. Beyond metal rods and coils glittered dimly, and something whirled rods and trabited befetkel. The vague shape of the thing he meant to say was already in his mind. But this silence, this isolation, the sudden withdrawal from that contagious crowd, this silent audience of gaping, glaring machines had not been in his anticipation. All his supports seemed withdrawn together. He seemed to have dropped into this suddenly to have discovered himself. In a moment he was changed. He found that he now feared to be inadequate. He feared to be theatrical. He feared the quality of his voice, the quality of his wit. Astonished, he turned to the man in yellow with a propitiatory gesture. "For a moment," he said, "I must wait. I did not think it would be like this. I must think of the thing I have to say." While he was still hesitating, there came an agitated messenger with news that the foremost aeroplanes were passing over Erewhon. "Erewhon," he said. "Where is that? But anyhow, they are coming. They will be here. When?" "By twilight." "Great God! In only a few hours. What news of the flying stages?" he asked. "The people of the Southwest wards are ready." "Ready!" He turned impatiently to the blank circles of the lenses again. "I suppose it must be a sort of speech. Would to God I knew certainly the thing that should be said. Aeroplanes at Erewhon. They must have started before the main fleet, and the people only ready. Surely." "Oh, what does it matter whether I speak well or ill?" he said, and felt the light grow brighter. He had framed some vague sentence of democratic sentiment when suddenly doubts overwhelmed him. His belief in his heroic quality and calling, he found, had altogether lost its assured conviction. The picture of a little strutting futility in a windy waste of incomprehensible destinies replaced it. Abruptly it was perfectly clear to him that this revolt against Ostrog was premature, foredoomed to failure, the impulse of passionate inadequacy against inevitable things. He thought of that swift flight of aeroplanes like the swoop of fate towards him. He was astonished that he could have seen things in any other light. In that final emergency he debated, thrust debate resolutely aside, determined at all costs to go through with the thing he had undertaken, and he could find no word to begin. Even as he stood, awkward, hesitating, with an indiscreet apology for his inability trembling on his lips, came the noise of many people crying out, the running to and fro of feet. "Wait!" cried someone, and a door opened. "She is coming," said the voices. Graham turned, and the watching lights waned. Through the open doorway he saw a slight gray figure advancing across a spacious hall. His heart leapt. It was Helen Wotton. Behind and about her marched a riot of applause. The man in yellow came out of the nearer shadows into the circle of light. "This is the girl who told us what Ostrich had done," he said. Her face was aflame, and the heavy coils of her black hair fell about her shoulders. The folds of the soft silk robe she wore streamed from her and floated in the rhythm of her advance. She drew nearer and nearer, and his heart was beating fast. All his doubts were gone. The shadow of the doorway fell athwart her face, and she was near him. "You have not betrayed us," she cried. "You are with us. Where have you been?" said Graham. "At the office of the Southwest Wards. Until 10 minutes since I did not know you had returned. I went to the office of the Southwest Wards to find the ward leaders in order that they might tell the people. I came back so soon as I heard. I knew," she cried, "knew you would be with us. And it was I that told them. They have risen. All the world is rising. The people have awakened. Thank God that I did not act in vain. You are master still." "You told them," he said slowly, and he saw that in spite of her steady eyes her lips trembled and her throat rose and fell. "I told them. I knew of the order. I was here. I heard that the Negroes were to come to London to guard you and to keep the people down to keep you a prisoner. And I stalked it. I came out and told the people. And you are master still." Graham glanced at the black lenses of the cameras, the vast listening ears, and back to her face. "I am master still," he said slowly, and the swift rush of a fleet of aeroplanes passed across his thoughts. "And you did this, you, who are the niece of Ostro. For you," she cried, "for you, that you for whom the world has waited should not be cheated of your power." Graham stood for a space, wordless, regarding her. His doubts and questionings had fled before her presence. He remembered the things that he had meant to say. He faced the cameras again, and the light about him grew brighter. He turned again towards her. "You have saved me," he said. "You have saved my power, and the battle is beginning. God knows what this night will see, but not dishonor." He paused. He addressed himself to the unseen multitudes who stared upon him through those grotesque black eyes. At first he spoke slowly. "Men and women of the new age," he said, "you have arisen to do battle for the race. There is no easy victory before us." He stopped to gather words. The thoughts that had been in his mind before she came returned, but transfigured, no longer touched with the shadow of a possible irrelevance. "This night is a beginning," he cried. "This battle that is coming, this battle that rushes upon us tonight, is only a beginning. All your lives it may be, you must fight. Take no thought though I am beaten, though I am utterly overthrown." He found the thing in his mind too vague for words. He paused momentarily and broke into vague exhortations, and then a rush of speech came upon him. Much that he said was but the humanitarian commonplace of a vanished age, but the conviction of his voice touched it to vitality. He stated the case of the old days to the people of the new age, to the woman at his side. "I come out of the past to you," he said, "with the memory of an age that hoped. My age was an age of dreams of beginnings, an age of noble hopes. Throughout the world we had made an end of slavery. Throughout the world we had spread the desire and anticipation that wars might cease, that all men and women might live nobly, in freedom and peace. So we hoped in the days that are past. And what of those hopes? How is it with man after 200 years? Great cities, vast powers, a collective greatness beyond our dreams. For that we did not work, and that has come. But how is it with the little lives that make up this greater life? How is it with the common lives? As it has ever been sorrow and labor, lives cramped and unfulfilled, lives tempted by power, tempted by wealth, and gone to waste in folly. The old faiths have faded and changed. The new faith, is there a new faith? Things that he had long wished to believe, he found that he believed. He plunged at belief and seized it and clung for a time at her level. He spoke gustily in broken, incomplete sentences, but with all his heart and strength, of this new faith within him. He spoke of the greatness of self-abnegation, of his belief in an immortal life of humanity in which we live and move and have our being. His voice rose and fell, and the recording appliances hummed their hurried applause. Dim attendants watched him out of the shadow. Through all those doubtful places, his sense of that silent spectator beside him sustained his sincerity. For a few glorious moments he was carried away. He felt no doubt of his heroic quality, no doubt of his heroic words. He had it all straight and plain. His eloquence limped no longer, and at last he made an end to speaking. "Here and now," he cried, "I make my will. All that is mine in the world I give to the people of the world. All that is mine in the world I give to the people of the world. I give it to you, and myself I give to you, and as God wills, I will live for you, or I will die." He ended with a florid gesture and turned about. He found the light of his present exaltation reflected in the face of the girl. Their eyes met. Her eyes were swimming with tears of enthusiasm. They seemed to be urged towards each other. They clasped hands and stood gripped, facing one another, in an eloquent silence. She whispered, "I knew," she whispered, "I knew." He could not speak. He crushed her hand in his. His mind was the theater of gigantic passions. The man in yellow was beside them. Neither had noted his coming. He was saying that the Southwest wards were marching. "I never expected it so soon," he cried. "They have done wonders. You must send them a word to help them on their way." Graham dropped Helen's hand and stared at him absent-mindedly. Then with a start he returned to his previous preoccupation about the flying stages. "Yes," he said. "That is good, that is good." He weighed a message. "Tell them. Well done, Southwest." He turned his eyes to Helen Wotton again. His face expressed his struggle between conflicting ideas. "We must capture the flying stages," he explained. "Unless we can do that, they will land Negroes. At all costs we must prevent that." He felt even as he spoke that this was not what had been in his mind before the interruption. He saw a touch of surprise in her eyes. She seemed about to speak, and a shrill bell drowned her voice. It occurred to Graham that she expected him to lead these marching people, that was the thing he had to do. He made the offer abruptly. He addressed the man in yellow, but he spoke to her. He saw her face respond. "Here I am, doing nothing," he said. "It is impossible," protested the man in yellow. "It is a fight in a warren. Your place is here," he explained elaborately. He motioned towards the room where Graham must wait. He insisted no other course was possible. "We must know where you are," he said. "At any moment, a crisis may arise needing your presence and decision." The room was a luxurious little apartment with news machines and a broken mirror that had once been en rapport with the crow's nest specula. It seemed a matter of course to Graham that Helen should stop with him. A picture had drifted through his mind of such a vast dramatic struggle as the masses in the ruins had suggested. But here was no spectacular battlefield such as he imagined. Instead was seclusion and suspense. It was only as the afternoon wore on that he pieced together a truer picture of the fight that was raging, inaudibly and invisibly, within 4 miles of him, beneath the Roehampton stage. A strange and unprecedented contest it was, a battle that was 100,000 little battles, a battle in a sponge of ways and channels, fought out of sight of sky or sun under the electric glare, fought out in a vast confusion by multitudes untrained in arms, led chiefly by acclamation, multitudes dulled by mindless labor and enervated by the tradition of 200 years of servile security, against multitudes demoralized by lives of venial privilege and sensual indulgence. They had no artillery, no differentiation into this force or that. The only weapon on either side was the little green metal carbine, whose secret manufacture and sudden distribution in enormous quantities had been one of Ostrog's culminating moves against the council. Few had had any experience with this weapon, many had never discharged one, many who carried it came unprovided with ammunition. Never was wilder firing in the history of warfare. It was a battle of amateurs, a hideous experimental warfare. Armed rioters fighting armed rioters swept forward by the words and fury of a song, by the tramping sympathy of their numbers, pouring in countless myriads. Towards the smaller ways, the disabled lifts, the galleries slippery with blood, the halls and passages choked with smoke, beneath the flying stages, to learn there when retreat was hopeless, the ancient mysteries of warfare. And overhead, save for a few sharpshooters upon the roof spaces, and for a few bands and threads of vapor that multiplied and darkened towards the evening, the day was a clear serenity. Ostrog, it seems, had no bombs at command, and in all the earlier phases of the battle, the aeroplanes played no part. Not the smallest cloud was there to break the empty brilliance of the sky. It seemed as though it held itself vacant until the aeroplanes should come. Ever and again there was news of these, drawing nearer, from this Mediterranean port and then that, and presently from the south of France. But of the new guns that Ostrog had made and which were known to be in the city came no news in spite of Graham's urgency, nor any report of successes from the dense felt of fighting strands about the flying stages. Section after section of his labor societies reported itself assembled, reported itself marching, and vanished from knowledge into the labyrinth of that warfare. What was happening there? Even the busy ward leaders did not know. In spite of the opening and closing of doors, the hasty messengers, the ringing of bells, and the perpetual clitter-clack of recording implements, Graham felt isolated, strangely inactive, inoperative. Their isolation seemed at times the strangest, the most unexpected of all the things that had happened since his awakening. It had something of the quality of that inactivity that comes in dreams. A tumult, the stupendous realization of a world struggle between Ostrog and himself. And then this confined quiet little room with its mouthpieces and bells and broken mirror. Now the door would be closed and they were alone together. They seemed sharply marked off then from all the unprecedented world storm that rushed. Together without, vividly aware of one another, only concerned with one another. Then the door would open again, messengers would enter, or a sharp bell would stab their quiet privacy, and it was like a window in a well-built, brightly lit house flung open suddenly to a hurricane. The dark hurry and tumult, the stress and vehemence of the battle rushed in and overwhelmed them. They were no longer persons but mere spectators, mere impressions of a tremendous convulsion. They became unreal even to themselves, miniatures of personality, indescribably small, and the two antagonistic realities, the only realities in being, were first the city, that throbbed and roared yonder in a belated frenzy of defense, and secondly, the aeroplanes hurling inexorably towards them over the round shoulder of the world. At first their mood had been one of exalted competence. A great pride had possessed them, a pride in one another for the greatness of the issues they had challenged. At first he had walked the room eloquent with the transitory, persuasion of his tremendous destiny. But slowly uneasy intimations of their coming defeat touched his spirit. There came a long period in which they were alone. He changed his theme, became egotistical, spoke of the wonder of his sleep, of the little life of his memories, remote yet minute and clear, like something seen through an inverted opera glass, and all the brief play of desires and errors that had made his former life. She said little, but the emotion in her face followed the tones in his voice, and it seemed to him he had at last a perfect understanding. He reverted from pure reminiscence to that sense of greatness she imposed upon him. And through it all, this destiny was before me, he said, this vast inheritance of which I did not dream. Insensibly, their heroic preoccupation with the revolutionary struggle passed to the question of their relationship. He began to question her. She told him of the days before his awakening, spoke with a brief vividness of the girlish dreams that had given a bias to her life, of the incredulous emotions his awakening had aroused. She told him, too, of a tragic circumstance of her girlhood that had darkened her life, quickened her sense of injustice, and opened her heart prematurely to the wider sorrows of the world. For a little time, so far as he was concerned, the great war about them was but the vast ennobling background to these personal things. In an instant these personal relations were submerged. There came messengers to tell that a great fleet of aeroplanes was rushing between the sky and Avignon. He went to the crystal dial in the corner and assured himself that the thing was so. He went to the chart room and consulted a map to measure the distances of Avignon, New Arawan, and London. He made swift calculations. He went to the room of the ward leaders to ask for news of the fight for the stages, and there was no one there. After a time, he came back to her. His face had changed. It had dawned upon him that the struggle was, perhaps, more than half over, that Ostrog was holding his own, that the arrival of the aeroplanes would mean a panic that might leave him helpless. A chance phrase in the message had given him a glimpse of the reality that came. Each of these soaring giants bore its 1,000 half-savage Negroes to the death grapple of the city. Suddenly, his humanitarian enthusiasm showed flimsy. Only 2 of the ward leaders were in their room when presently he repaired thither. The hall of the Atlas seemed empty. He fancied a change in the bearing of the attendants in the outer rooms. A somber disillusionment darkened his mind. She looked at him anxiously when he returned to her. "No news," he said with an assumed carelessness in answer to her eyes. Then he was moved to frankness, or rather bad news. "We are losing. We are gaining no ground, and the aeroplanes draw nearer and nearer." He walked the length of the room and turned. "Unless we can capture those flying stages in the next hour, there will be horrible things. We shall be beaten." "No," she said. "We have justice. We have the people. We have God on our side. Ostrog has discipline. He has plans. Do you know, out there just now I felt, when I heard that these aeroplanes were a stage nearer, I felt as if I were fighting the machinery of fate." She made no answer for a while. "We have done right," she said at last. He looked at her doubtfully. "We have done what we could. But does this depend upon us? Is it not an older sin, a wider sin?" "What do you mean?" she asked. "These blacks are savages, ruled by force, used as force. And they have been." Under the rule of the whites, 200 years. Is it not a race quarrel? The race sinned, the race pays. But these laborers, these poor people of London, vicarious atonement. To stand wrong is to share the guilt. She looked keenly at him, astonished at the new aspect he presented. Without came the shrill ringing of a bell, the sound of feet, and the gabble of a phonographic message. The man in yellow appeared. "Yes," said Graham. They're at Bitchy. Where are the attendants who were in the great hall of the Atlas? Asked Graham abruptly. Presently the babble machine rang again. We may win yet, said the man in. Yellow, going out to it. If only we can find where Ostrog has hidden his guns. Everything hangs on that now. Perhaps this Graham followed him. But the only news was of the aeroplanes. They had reached Orleans. Graham returned to Helen. No news, he said, no news. And we can do nothing? Nothing. He paced impatiently. Suddenly the swift anger that was his nature swept upon him. Curse this complex world, he cried, and all the inventions of men, that a man must die like a rat in a snare and never see his foe. Oh, for one blow! He turned with an abrupt change in his manner. That's nonsense, he said. I am a savage. He paced and stopped. After all, London and Paris are only two cities. All the temperate zone has risen. What if London is doomed and Paris destroyed? These are but accidents. Again came the mockery of news to call him to fresh inquiries. He returned with a graver face and sat down beside her. The end must be near, he said. The people, it seems, have fought and died in tens of thousands. The ways about Roehampton must be like a smoked beehive, and they have died in vain. They are still only at the sub-stage. The aeroplanes are near Paris. Even were a gleam of success to come now, there would be nothing to do. There would be no time to do anything before they were upon us. The guns that might have saved us are mislaid. Mislaid. Think of the disorder of things. Think of this foolish tumult that cannot even find its weapons. Oh, for one aeropile, just one. For the want of that, I am beaten. Humanity is beaten, and our cause is lost. My kingship, my headlong foolish kingship, will not last a night, and I have egged on the people to fight. They would have fought anyhow. I doubt it. I have come among them. No, she cried, not that. If defeat comes, if you die. But even that cannot be. It cannot be after all these years. Ah, we have meant well. But do you indeed believe? If they defeat you, she cried, you have spoken. Your word has gone like a great wind through the world, fanning liberty into a flame. What if the flame sputters a little? Nothing can change the spoken word. Your message will have gone forth. To what end? It may be. It may be. You know, I said, when you told me of these things, dear God, but that was scarcely a score of hours ago. I said that I had not your faith. Well, at any rate, there is nothing to do now. You have not my faith. Do you mean? You are sorry? No, he said hurriedly. No, before God, no. His voice changed. But I think I have been indiscreet. I knew little. I grasped too hastily. He paused. He was ashamed of this avowal. There is one thing that makes up for all. I have known you. Across this gulf of time I have come to you. The rest is done. It is done. With you too it has been something more or something less. He paused with his face searching hers and without clamored the unheeded message that the aeroplanes were rising into the sky of Amiens. She put her hand to her throat, and her lips were white. She stared before her as if she saw some horrible possibility. Suddenly her features changed. "Oh, but I have been honest," she cried, and then, "Have I been honest? I loved the world and freedom. I hated cruelty and oppression. Surely it was that." "Yes," he said, "yes, and we have done what it lay in us to do. We have given our message, our message. We have started Armageddon. But now that we have, it may be our last hour, together, now that all these greater things are done." He stopped. She sat in silence. Her face was a white riddle. For a moment they heeded nothing of a sudden stir outside, a running to and fro and cries. Then Helen started to an attitude of tense attention. "It is," she cried, and stood up, speechless, incredulous, triumphant. And Graham, too, heard. Metallic voices were shouting, "Victory!" Yes, it was victory. He stood up also, with the light of a desperate hope in his eyes. Bursting through the curtains appeared the man in yellow, startled and disheveled with excitement. "Victory!" he cried. "Victory! The people are winning." Ostrog's people have collapsed. She rose. "Victory?" and her voice was hoarse and faint. "What do you mean?" asked Graham. "Tell me, what?" "We have driven them out of the under galleries at Norwood. Streatham is afire and burning wildly, and Roehampton is ours. Ours! And we have taken the aeropile that lay thereon." For an instant Graham and Helen stood in silence. Their hearts were beating fast. They looked at one another. For one last moment there gleamed in Graham his dream of empire, of kingship, with Helen by his side. It gleamed and passed. A shrill bell rang. An agitated gray-headed man appeared from the room of the Collas. Ward leaders. "It is all over," he cried. "What matters it now that we have Roehampton? The aeroplanes have been sighted at Boulogne." "The Channel," said the man in yellow. He calculated swiftly. "Half an hour." "They still have 3 of the flying stages," said the old man. "Those guns," cried Graham. "We cannot mount them in half an hour." "Do you mean they are found?" "Too late," said the old man. "If we could stop them another hour," cried the man in yellow. "Nothing can stop them now," said the old man. "They have near 100 aeroplanes in the first fleet." "Another hour?" asked Graham. "To be so near," said the ward leader. "Now that we have found those guns. To be so near. If once we could get them out upon the roof spaces." "How long would that take?" asked Graham suddenly. "An hour certainly." "Too late," cried the ward leader. "Too late." "Is it too late?" said Graham. Even now, an hour. He had suddenly perceived a possibility. He tried to speak calmly, but his face was white. "There is one chance. You said there was an aeropile." "On the Roehampton stage, sire." "Smashed?" "No. It is lying crossways to the carrier. It might be got upon the guides easily, but there is no aeronaut." Graham glanced at the 2 men, and then at Helen. He spoke after a long pause. "We have no aeronauts?" "None." "The aeroplanes are clumsy," he said thoughtfully, "compared with the aeropiles." He turned suddenly to Helen. His decision was made. "I must do it." "Do what?" "Go to this flying stage, to this aeropile." "What do you mean? I am an aeronaut, after all. Those days for which you reproached me were not wasted." He turned to the old man in yellow. "Put the aeropile upon the guides." The man in yellow hesitated. "What do you mean to do?" cried Helen. "This aeropile, it is a chance." "You don't mean to fight?" "Yes, to fight in the air. I have thought before. An aeroplane is a clumsy thing. A resolute man." "But never since flying began," cried the man in yellow. "There has been no need. But now, the time has come. Tell them, now. Send them my message to put it upon the guides." The old man dumbly interrogated the man in yellow, nodded, and hurried out. Helen made a step towards Graham. Her face was white. But how can one fight? You will be killed. Perhaps, yet not to do it or to let someone else attempt it. He stopped. He could speak no more. He swept the alternative aside by a gesture, and they stood looking at one another. "You are right," she said at last in a low tone. "You are right. If it can be done." Must go. Those days for not altogether. He moved a step towards her, and she stepped back. Her white face struggled against him and resisted him. "No," she gasped. "I cannot bear." "Go now." He extended his hands stupidly. She clenched her fists. "Go now," she cried. "Go now." He hesitated and understood. He threw his hands up in a queer half-theatrical gesture. He had no word to say. He turned from her. The man in yellow moved towards the door with clumsy, belated tact. But Graham stepped past him. He went striding through the room where the ward leader bawled at a telephone directing that the arrow piles should be put upon the guides. The man in yellow glanced at Helen's still figure, hesitated and hurried after him. Graham did not once look back. He did not speak until the curtain of the antechamber of the great hall fell behind him. Then he turned his head with curt, swift directions upon his bloodless lips. Chapter 24. The Coming of the Aeroplanes. Two men in pale blue were lying in the irregular line that stretched along the edge of the captured Roehampton stage from end to end, grasping their carbines and peering into the shadows of the stage called Wimbledon Park. Now and then they spoke to one another. They spoke the mutilated English of their class and period. The fire of the ostrichites had dwindled and ceased, and few of the enemy had been seen for some time. But the echoes of the fight that was going on now far below in the lower galleries of that stage came every now and then between the staccato of shots from the popular side. One of these men was describing to the other how he had seen a man down below there dodge behind a girder and had aimed at a guess and hit him cleanly as he dodged too far. "He's down there still," said the marksman. "See that little patch?" "Yes, between those bars." A few yards behind them lay a dead stranger, face upward to the sky, with the blue canvas of his jacket smoldering in a circle about the neat bullet hole on his chest. Close beside him, a wounded man, with a leg swathed about, sat with an expressionless face and watched the progress of that burning. Gigantic behind them, athwart the carrier lay the captured aeropile. "I can't see him now," said the second man in a tone of provocation. The marksman became foul-mouthed and high-voiced in his earnest endeavor to make things plain, and suddenly interrupting him, came a noisy shouting from the substage. "What's going on now?" he said, and raised himself on one arm to stare at the stairheads in the central groove of the stage. A number of blue figures were coming up these, and swarming across the stage to the aeropile. "We don't want all these fools," said his friend. "They only crowd up and spoil shots." "What are they after?" "Shh, they're shouting something." The two men listened. The swarming newcomers had crowded densely about the aeropile. 3 ward leaders, conspicuous by their black mantles and badges, clambered into the body and appeared above it. The rank and file flung themselves upon the vans, gripping hold of the edges until the entire outline of the thing was manned, in some places 3 deep. One of the marksmen knelt up. "They're putting it on the carrier, that's what they're after." He rose to his feet. His friend rose also. "What's the good?" said his friend. "We've got no aeronauts. That's what they're doing anyhow." He looked at his rifle, looked at the struggling crowd, and suddenly turning to the wounded man. "Mind these, mate," he said, handing his carbine and cartridge belt, and in a moment he was running towards the aeropile. For a quarter of an hour he was a perspiring Titan, lugging, thrusting, shouting and heating shouts, and then the thing was done. And he stood with a multitude of others cheering their own achievement. By this time he knew, what indeed everyone in the city knew, that the master, raw learner though he was, intended to fly this machine himself, was coming even now to take control of it, would let no other man attempt it. He who takes the greatest danger, he who bears the heaviest burden, that man is king. So the master was reported to have spoken. And even as this man cheered, and while the beads of sweat still chased one another from the disorder of his hair, he heard the thunder of a greater tumult, and in fitful snatches the beat and impulse of the revolutionary song. He saw through a gap in the people that a thick stream of heads still poured up the stairway. "The master is coming," shouted voices, "the master is coming." And the crowd about him grew denser and denser. He began to thrust himself towards the central groove. "The master is coming, the sleeper, the master, God and the master," roared the voices, and suddenly quite close to him were the black uniforms of the Revolutionary Guard. And for the first and last time in his life he saw Graham, saw him quite nearly. A tall, dark man in a flowing black robe, with a white, resolute face and eyes fixed steadfastly before him. A man who for all the little things about him held neither ears nor eyes nor thoughts. Ha! For all his days, that man remembered the passing of Graham's bloodless face. In a moment it had gone, and he was fighting in the swaying crowd, a lad weeping with terror thrust against him, pressing towards the stairways, yelling, "Clear for the aeropile!" The bell that clears the flying stage became a loud, unmelodious clanging. With that clanging in his ears, Graham drew near the aeropile, marched into the shadow of its tilting wing. He became aware that a number of people about him were offering to accompany him, and waved their offers aside. He wanted to think how one started the engine. The bell clanged faster and faster, and the feet of the retreating people roared faster and louder. The man in yellow was assisting him to mount through the ribs of the body. He clambered into the aeronaut's place, fixing himself very carefully and deliberately. What was it? The man in yellow was pointing to two aeropiles driving upward in the southern sky. No doubt they were looking for the coming aeroplanes. That presently the thing to do now was to start. Things were being shouted at him, questions, warnings, they bothered him. He wanted to think about the aeropile, to recall every item of his previous experience. He waved the people from him, saw the man in yellow dropping off through the ribs, saw the crowd cleft down the line of the girders by his gesture. For a moment he was motionless, staring at the levers, the wheel by which the engine shifted, and all the delicate appliances of which he knew so little. His eye caught a spirit level with the bubble towards him, and he remembered something. Spent a dozen seconds in swinging the engine forward until the bubble floated in the center of the two. He noted that the people were not shouting, knew they watched his deliberation. A bullet smashed on the bar above. His head. Who fired? Was the line clear of people? He stood up to see, and sat down again. In another second the propeller was spinning, and he was rushing down the guides. He gripped the wheel and swung the engine back to lift the stem. Then it was the people shouted. In a moment he was throbbing with the quiver of the engine, and the shouts dwindled swiftly behind, rushed down to silence. The wind whistled over the edges of the screen, and the world sank away from him very swiftly. Throb, 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 throb. Up he drove. He fancied himself free of all excitement, felt cool and deliberate. He lifted the stem still more, opened one valve on his left wing, and swept round and up. He looked down with a steady head, and up. One of the ostrogite aeropiles was driving across his course, so that he drove obliquely towards it and would pass below it at a steep angle. Its Little aeronauts were peering down at him. What did they mean to do? His mind became active. One he saw held a weapon pointing, seemed prepared to fire. What did they think he meant to do? In a moment he understood their tactics, and his resolution was taken. His momentary lethargy was past. He opened two more valves to his left, swung round, end onto this hostile machine, closed his valves, and shot straight at it, stem and windscreen shielding him from the shot. They tilted a little as if to clear him. He flung up his stem. Throb, 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 pause, throb, throb. He set his teeth, his face into an involuntary grimace, and crash, he struck it. He struck upward beneath the nearer wing. Very slowly the wing of his antagonist seemed to broaden as the impetus of his blow turned it up. He saw the full breadth of it, and then it slid downward out of his sight. He felt his stem going down, his hands tightened on the levers, whirled and rammed the engine back. He felt the jerk of a clearance, the nose of the machine jerked upward steeply, and for a moment he seemed to be lying on his back. The machine was reeling and staggering, it seemed to be dancing on its screw. He made a huge effort, hung for a moment on the levers, and slowly the engine came forward again. He was driving upward, but no longer so steeply. He gasped for a moment and flung himself at the levers again. The wind whistled about him. One further effort and he was almost level. He could breathe. He turned his head for the first time to see what had become of his antagonists. Turned back to the levers for a moment and looked again. For a moment he could have believed they were annihilated. And then he saw between the two stages to the east was a chasm, and down this something, a slender edge, fell swiftly and vanished as a sixpence falls down a crack. At first he did not understand, and then a wild joy possessed him. He shouted at the top of his voice, an inarticulate shout, and drove higher and higher up the sky. Throb, 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 pause, throb, 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 throb. Where was the other aeropile? He thought. They too. As he looked round the empty heavens, he had a momentary fear that this machine had risen above him, and then he saw it alighting on the Norwood stage. They had meant shooting. To risk being rammed headlong 2,000 feet in the air was beyond their latter-day courage. The combat was declined. For a little while he circled, then swooped in a steep descent towards the westward stage. Throb, 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 throb. The twilight was creeping on apace. The smoke from the Streatham stage that had been so dense and dark was now a pillar of fire, and all the laced curves of the moving ways and the translucent roofs and domes and the chasms between the buildings were glowing softly now, lit by the tempered radiance of the electric light that the glare of the way overpowered. The three efficient stages that the Ostrigites held for Wimbledon Park was useless because of the fire from Roehampton, and Streatham was a furnace, were glowing with guide lights for the coming aeroplanes. As he swept over the Roehampton stage, he saw the dark masses of the people thereon. He heard a clap of frantic cheering, heard a bullet from the Wimbledon Park stage tweet through the air, and went beating up above the Surrey wastes. He felt a breath of wind from the southwest, and lifted his westward wing as he had learnt to do, and so drove upward, heeling into the rare, swift upper air. Throb, 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 throb. Up he drove and up, to that pulsating rhythm, until the country beneath was blue and indistinct, and London spread like a little map traced in light, like the mere model of a city near the brim of the horizon. The southwest was a sky of sapphire over the shadowy rim of the world, and ever as he drove upward the multitude of stars increased. And behold, In the southward, low down and glittering swiftly nearer, were two little patches of nebulous light, and then two more, and then a nebulous glow of swiftly driving shapes. Presently he could count them. There were 24. The first fleet of aeroplanes had come. Beyond appeared a yet greater glow. He swept round in a half-circle, staring at this advancing fleet. It flew in a wedge-like shape, a triangular flight of gigantic phosphorescent shapes, sweeping nearer through the lower air. He made a swift calculation of their pace and spun the little wheel that brought the engine forward. He touched a lever, and the throbbing effort of the engine ceased. He began to fall, fell swifter and swifter. He aimed at the apex of the wedge. He dropped like a stone through the whistling air. It seemed scarce a second from that soaring moment before he struck the foremost aeroplane. No man of all that black multitude saw the coming of his fate. No man among them dreamt of the hawk that struck downward upon him out of the sky. Those who were not limp in the agonies of air sickness were craning their black necks and staring to see the filmy city that was rising out of the haze, the rich and splendid city to which Massa Boss had brought their obedient muscles. Bright teeth gleamed and the glossy faces shone. They had heard of Paris. They knew they were to have lordly times among the poor white trash. And suddenly Graham struck them. He had aimed at the body of the aeroplane, but at the very last instant a better idea had flashed into his mind. He twisted about and struck near the edge of the starboard wing with all his accumulated weight. He was jerked back as he struck. His prow went gliding across its smooth expanse towards the rim. He felt the forward rush of the huge fabric sweeping him and his aeropile along with it, and for a moment that seemed an age, he could not tell what was happening. He heard a thousand throats yelling, and perceived that his machine was balanced on the edge of the gigantic float and driving down, glanced over his shoulder and saw the backbone of the aeroplane and the opposite float swaying up. He had a vision through the ribs of sliding chairs, staring faces and hands clutching at the tilting guide bars. The fenestrations in the further float flashed open as the aeronaut tried to right her. Beyond, he saw a second aeroplane leaping steeply to escape the whirl of its heeling fellow. The broad area of swaying wings seemed to jerk upward. He felt his aeropile had dropped clear, that the monstrous fabric, clean overturned, hung like a sloping wall above him. He did not clearly understand that he had struck the side float of the aeroplane and slipped off, but he perceived that he was flying free on the down glide and rapidly nearing earth. What had he done? His heart throbbed like a noisy engine in his throat, and for a perilous instant he could not move his levers because of the paralysis of his hands. He wrenched the levers to throw his engine back, fought for 2 seconds against the weight of it, felt himself righting, driving horizontally, set the engine beating again. He looked upward and saw 2 aeroplanes glide shouting far overhead, looked back and saw the main body of the fleet opening out and rushing upward and outward, saw the one he had struck fall edgewise on and strike like a gigantic knife blade along the wind wheels below it. He put down his stern and looked again. He drove up heedless of his direction as he watched. He saw the wind vanes give, saw the huge fabric strike the earth, saw its downward vans crumple with the weight of its descent, and then the whole mass turned over and smashed, upside down, upon the sloping wheels. Throb, 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 pause. Suddenly, from the heaving wreckage a thin tongue of white fire licked up towards the zenith. And then he was aware of a huge mass flying through the air towards him and turned upwards just in time to escape. The charge of it was a charge of a second aeroplane. It whirled by below, sucked him down a fathom, and nearly turned him over in the gust of its close passage. He became aware of 3 others rushing towards him, aware of the urgent necessity of beating above them. Aeroplanes were all about him, circling wildly to avoid him as it seemed. They drove past him, above, below, eastward and westward. Far away to the westward was the sound of a collision and two falling flares. Far away to the southward a second squadron was coming. Steadily he beat upward. Presently all the aeroplanes were below him, but for a moment he doubted the height he had of them, and did not swoop again. And then he came down upon a second victim, and all its load of soldiers saw him coming. The big machine heeled and swayed as the fear-maddened men scrambled to the stern for their weapons. A score of bullets sung through the air, and there flashed a star in the thick glass windscreen that protected him. The aeroplane slowed and dropped to foil his stroke, and dropped too low. Just in time he saw the wind. Wheels of Bromley Hill rushing up towards him and spun about and up as the aeroplane he had chased crashed among them. All its voices wove into a felt of yelling. The great fabric seemed to be standing on end for a second among the heeling and splintering bands, and then it flew to pieces. Huge splinters came flying through the air. Its engines burst like shells. A hot rush of flame shot overhead into the darkling sky. "Two!" he cried, with a bomb from overhead bursting as it fell, and forthwith he was beating up again. A glorious exhilaration possessed him now, a giant activity. His troubles about humanity, about his inadequacy, were gone forever. He was a man in battle rejoicing in his power. Aeroplanes seemed radiating from him in every direction, intent only upon avoiding him. The yelling of their packed passengers came in short gusts as they swept by. He chose his third quarry, struck hastily and did but turn it on edge. It escaped him to smash against the tall cliff of London Wall. Flying from that impact he skimmed the darkling ground so nearly he could see a frightened rabbit bolting up a slope. He jerked up steeply and found himself driving over South London with the air about him vacant. To the right of him a wild riot of signal rockets from the Ostrigites banged tumultuously in the sky. To the south the wreckage of half a dozen airships flamed, and east and west and north the airships fled before him. They drove away to the east and north and went about in the south, for they could not pause in the air. In their present confusion, any attempt at evolution would have meant disastrous collisions. He could scarcely realize the thing he had done. In every quarter aeroplanes were receding. They were receding. They dwindled smaller and smaller. They were in flight. He passed 200 feet or so above the Roehampton stage. It was black with people and noisy with their frantic shouting. But why was the Wimbledon Park stage black and cheering too? The smoke and flame of Streatham now hid the three further stages. He curved about and rose to see them and the northern quarters. First came the square masses of Shooter's Hill into sight from behind the smoke, lit and orderly with the aeroplane that had landed and its disembarking Negroes. Then came Blackheath, and then under the corner of the reek the Norwood stage. On Blackheath no aeroplane had landed, but an aeropile lay upon the guides. Norwood was covered by a swarm of little figures running to and fro in a passionate confusion. Why? Abruptly he understood. The stubborn defense of the flying stages was over. The people were pouring into the underways of these last strongholds of Ostrog's usurpation. And then, from far away on the northern border of the city, full of glorious import to him, came a sound, a signal, a note of triumph, the leaden thud of a gun. His lips fell apart. His face was disturbed with emotion. He drew an immense breath. "They win," he shouted to the empty air. "The people win." The sound of a second gun came like an answer. And then he saw the aeropile on Blackheath was running down its guides to launch. It lifted clean. And rose. It shot up into the air, driving straight southward and away from him. In an instant it came to him what this meant. It must needs be ostrich in flight. He shouted and dropped towards it. He had the momentum of his elevation and fell slanting down the air and very swiftly. It rose steeply at his approach. He allowed for its velocity and drove straight upon it. It suddenly became a mere flat edge, and behold, he was past it and driving headlong down with all the force of his futile blow. He was furiously angry. He reeled the engine back along its shaft and went circling up. He saw Ostrog's machine beating up a spiral before him. He rose straight towards it, won above it by virtue of the impetus of his swoop and by the advantage and weight of a man. He dropped, headlong dropped, and missed again. As he rushed past, he saw the face of Ostrog's aeronaut, confident and cool, and in Ostrog's attitude a wincing resolution. Ostrog was looking steadfastly away from him to the south. He realized with a gleam of wrath how bungling his flight must be. Below he saw the Croydon hills. He jerked upward and once more he gained on his enemy. He glanced over his shoulder and his attention was arrested by a strange thing. The eastward stage, the one on Shooter's Hill, appeared to lift. A flash changing to a tall gray shape, a cowled figure of smoke and dust, jerked into the air. For a moment this cowled figure stood motionless, dropping huge masses of metal from its shoulders, and then it began to uncoil a dense head of smoke. The people had blown it up, aeroplane and all, as suddenly a second flash in gray shape sprang up from the Norwood stage. And even as he stared at this, came a dead report, and the air wave of the first explosion struck him. He was flung up and sideways. For a moment the aeropile fell nearly edgewise with her nose down and seemed to hesitate whether to overset altogether. He stood on his windshield wrenching the wheel that swayed up over his head. And then the shock of the second explosion took his machine sideways. He found himself clinging to one of the ribs of his machine, and the air was blowing past him and upward. He seemed to be hanging quite still in the air, with the wind blowing up past him. It occurred to him that he was falling. Then he was sure that he was falling. He could not look down. He found himself recapitulating with incredible swiftness all that had happened since his awakening. The days of doubt, the days of empire, and at last the tumultuous discovery of Ostrog's calculated treachery. He was beaten, but London was saved. London was saved. The thought had a quality of utter unreality. Who was he? Why was he holding so tightly with his hands? Why could he not leave go? In such a fall as this, countless dreams have ended. But in a moment he would wake. His thoughts ran swifter and swifter. He wondered if he should see Helen again. It seemed so unreasonable that he should not see her again. It must be a dream. Yet surely he would meet her. She at least was real. She was real. He would wake and meet her. Although he could not look at it, he was suddenly aware that the earth was very near. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey, the characters, and the world they carried with them. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more timeless books to be shared with listeners around the world. Until next time, thank you for listening.